strategic partnerships, might even transcend geography. And those who figure that out first, I think, are going to be the ones that are most powerful in this whole transition period.
Yeah, hey, transparency across the supply chain, the value chain is going to be critical to make this work. And therein lies exactly what you're talking about, the partnerships. I mean, that's going to be just everything from, and logistics, we haven't even touched base on logistics. My gosh, that's a critical component of it. You're moving, steel products all around the world, raw materials all around the world. So logistics across the supply chain, value chain, and decarbonizing of that process. The iron making, getting the electricity that you need on the site. That's a huge part of it. Getting the whole processing and value chain, the delivery of the steel products to the end user and the customer. Everyone's got to come on board, and therein lies the whole, if you will, footprint, carbon calculating, and transparency around it, and everyone agreeing that we're all on the same page and we're all moving towards the same targets. Let's talk about really the most efficient processes that were introduced with the EAF production and the flat rolled steel mini mills. And ultimately, it was a lower cost way to produce steel because it was the most efficient, but that in turn translated into a low footprint. And if you think about it, if you're really introducing the most efficient processing for steel, the most efficient use of energy, right, you should be the lowest cost producer and the most sustainable over the long haul. And of course, we know hydrogen is not going to be inexpensive by any stretch anytime soon. But could it be by 2040? Once the technology's developed, we got it at scale. Could we find that it's very, very effective and very cost effective at making steel? Could we find that we could do things much more efficiently than we could with, getting coal up out of the ground and moving around and putting and dumping it into furnaces? We might. Right. So therein lies the whole idea behind the green steel premium, and that there's clearly a cost associated. We all got to make that investment up front. It's going to happen, but where does that translate? Where does that go to in the future? And even if there's not a green steel premium, maybe there's some kind of significant discount for something that doesn't fit into a world in which much of the steel the people buying steel want it to be sustainable.
Yeah, it's a bit of a complicated question. I think that there is a premium, there is a value placed on a lower carbon footprint steel. There's no doubt in my mind there is a value to it. What that value number is, it could be debated, it could be discussed, but it won't be discussed here because we're not going to talk pricing. But there is a value that's being placed on decarbonized steel, and I think that's part of the equation both for investors, but it's also part of the equation for the steel supply chain, and I think it's got to be part of the equation for obviously for customers. You and I worked in an industry where we really sort of took the man hours per ton out of steel production, right? That was what we did. Correct, the energy intensity and the man hours per ton. That was a really big change, and I think that's part of what we have to remember is that we can't build these behemoth companies and put a lot of duplicity into the way we do things. We've got to be really thin in the way we develop these new greenfield plants. And this is going to be part of the equation as well, is developing a greenfield company or a greenfield plant with sort of that old egalitarian low man hour per ton, low energy costs, as low as you can, which is going to be difficult, as you said, for hydrogen, to be able to produce steel that's affordable, right? Doesn't mean there won't be a premium for green. There has to be. But we must have a cost consciousness of this thing too. That's why you and I love steel. First of all, you can't take carbon out of steel, as you know, right? Steel is, 98% iron. It's
defined by carbon.
Right. It's 98% iron, at a max or at the most 98% iron, which is iron ore that has to be brought in. That's the iron making portion of it. And then the other one is 2% to 0.002% of carbon to be able to be steel. So you cannot completely decarbonize something that must be made of carbon steel. That's by definition, right? So I think that's important. But I've said this to you many times, and I say it to a lot of people. I love steel because it's the most basic product or material that we have in our lives today. It's critical to our lives. And I think every developing country wants to be part of it. And so if we think about steel, it is recyclable. It's readily available because we've got a lot of iron ore in the world. And it's also a low cost material compared to a lot of other materials. So if we can decarbonize it, we make it even a better product. And that's what we've got to really try to focus to do.
I love the idea of talking about carbon and steel because I did talking with the mayor of Tuscaloosa here, the global world headquarters of Greenway. He said, Randy, I'm not a metallurgist or an engineer, but I thought if you took the carbon out of steel, you change the properties. And I said, oh, because right, remember, you think of low carbon as steel as something drawable, formable for an automotive
Right.
application or something, and then high carbon steel as being a spring steel for something, we talk low carbon steel means the embedded carbon, the emissions associated with a high carbon steel. So now we've got two terms for low carbon steel, right? One associates low carbon steel as we've always known it, and then there's low carbon steel in terms of emissions accounting.
Yeah, that
I
was an
had to
interesting
laugh.
conversation. I had that same conversation with somebody in Sweden when I was they're like low carbon steel. Well, don't you want to just make all low carbon steel? And I said, no, that's not the way it works. So, but their mine was the carbon intensity level, right? So
Yeah,
it
that's
it
right.
is funny how even the language itself is got to evolve to get through this.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's fun, isn't it?
No, that
Good
is
stuff.
work. The other thing we haven't touched base on is scrap, and
Oh
we
boy.
could do that a little bit here. Although I'm half tempted to say we ought to save some more of this conversation for later, like a part two, because we could go on and on.
Oh boy.
But yeah,
Yeah, we
I
sure
got to
could.
just ask you because I do scrap is a critical side of this, and it's going to be a
Yeah.
part. And we should save some time to talk about that. But you got to bear with me because I need to get some stories about going to Europe and selling steel in Europe and moving to Sweden, moving the family to Stockholm, and your experience with all that. As I caught up with you all the time, it just sounded like you loved it. It was a great
I did.
opportunity. You had a blast with it. You love being over there. You love the people. You love the process. I give you all the credit and respect in the world that you created new sales channels because you couldn't speak German, you could speak Italian,
No.
and yet
No. No.
all
My
the
language
sales
skills are pretty
contacts you had
limited.
in the U.S. weren't going to open doors for you in the EU. Just share some experiences, man.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would it's something that my wife and I both had always had as an ambition, personal
Yeah,
ambition, to be able to sort of work overseas, even if it was just a short stint. If it would have been 6 month stint, we probably would have taken the opportunity to do something like that. But it's funny. I got for anybody who doesn't keep their LinkedIn updated, let me tell you, it's amazing. But how I got the job at H2 was through LinkedIn. I actually got an email or an introductory email from the equity founders of H2. And it was January 5th, I think it was, if I remember correctly, January 5th of 2021. And they introduced themselves, talked about some other companies they were involved in and what they've done and what they've accomplished, and said, here's my personal mobile number. Give me a call if you're interested. I get a lot of LinkedIn stuff, and some of it, sometimes it's clearly tell it's maybe a little crazy. But I did a little background search and I said, wow, this is pretty interesting, right? So these guys seem to be real. And I called, and for the next 2 weeks, we just spent time on our virtual telephone calls. It was during COVID. So
yeah,
you say, wow, a lot of credit to pick up and move. Believe it or not, after 2 weeks of virtual calls, I decided I wanted to take this leap of faith and be part of this new transition, this new
yeah,
company. A lot of risk, right? I mean, there wasn't even Series A funding at that time. So, there was a lot of risk to do this, particularly moving to a foreign country. And you're right, we sold everything. We sold our
yeah.
home, we sold our cars, we sold everything. And just started over. So um, I think the exciting part of it was that first day, and I was a little nervous because I had never even been to Sweden ever in my life. I had never personally shaken hands with any of these people because of COVID. I couldn't come over until I actually had a working visa.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
it was crazy. I mean, some my family all thought I was nuts, and my friends thought I was crazy. But man, what a great experience, right? The people, the country, Europe in general. What a great chance to see Europe and meet different cultures and different people. Was language barrier a big issue? No, it wasn't, to be honest. I did use Google Translate every day in Sweden. When I was in the Middle East, I never used Google Translate, by the way. When I was in the Middle East, I was there for almost 5, 6 months. I never once used Google Translate in the Middle East. Oman is a beautiful country as well, if you've never been there. But I would say that it was challenging sometimes from the language point of view. But the company had English as its major, as its primary business language, so that made things easy. Um, I think there are cultural differences in the way people communicate, the way people make decisions. So I would urge anybody that looks overseas, make sure you do your homework in advance. It'll make things easier for you. I probably should have done more work in that area, right? It probably would have been easier. But in reality, I think people in this company in particular that I'm speaking of, they were just young and interested to change the world, right? And it was a lot of fun to be there, like to watch these visionary people from the older group to the younger group, because there was a span, the passion and vision for wanting to create something different because they cared about the earth and the planet was something that frankly I hadn't really experienced before. And I told them that when I interviewed, right? It was really fun to see that passion. Now, the pragmatic approach of me also tried to remind everybody that you have to make money doing this, right? That you have to be able to raise money. So I think the balance of all that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. I got a chance to see the Northern Lights, by the way, which was really cool in the northern part of Sweden. But yeah, I think I used my network in the US to get a couple phone calls in Europe that were really key in the beginning. Some cold calls that were sort of softened by some of the network that I had, and started making some cold calls to come when it was just me, in the sales department or in the commercial department, and made a few introductions. And then, we just built on that and hired a couple people that also had a network in Europe that were passionate about the planet. And we started to build our little commercial team. Randy, I know this is crazy. And as I said with you in the beginning, right? There's always a team of people. So please know that I considered all of H2 being part of the sales team. That's just part of the way it is. And frankly, if you build the right relationships with customers, they become part of your sales team, right? You want surrogates in this process. But there was only three of us in the sales department, myself and two other salespeople. So we accomplished that with a very small team, which was my mantra, right? It's the John Carenti mantra. Again, I got to give one of my mentors. I have lots of them to mention, but John Carenti was certainly one of my mentors, and he had a way of saying, hire 5 people, ask them to do the work of 10, and pay them as if they're 7. And so every time I've run a team or a department, that's the way I view things. I think you ought to hire the best of the best. Hire as few as you can, have them work really, really hard, but reward them for their hard work and for their results. And so that's what we certainly did in the commercial team there. And we had a great team. I mean, it was a phenomenal team that worked their butts off, coordinated very closely with the finance department, because after all, what you're doing in project finance is raising money. Selling steel and earning customers credibility and support and all that is what the sales team does. But in reality, the company is really raising money. That's in essence what you're doing as a project. And so, lots of fun, lots of great cities in Europe. I visited a lot of the beautiful cities of Europe in my time, both personally and unprofessionally. And Stockholm's a great city. I ended up buying a home in Sweden, in Stockholm, in downtown Stockholm. It would have been about a block or two away from the office had I stuck around. So it was a great opportunity, and I enjoyed my years there.
That's too cool. And hey, props to you for doing it, because ultimately but it just shows you the ripple effect, because it inspired, right, me to go out and found a company focused on this space after doing the research to try and understand what was going on, as with this technology, this new mill and decarbonization. It's fascinating times, man. Fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, Randy, think about that for a minute. I mean, you and I have kept in touch over these 3 years of this blossoming industry that we're in, right? We talk about a steel industry that's been around for 100 plus years, but yet it's a blossoming industry, a green industry, a decarbonized industry. I'm amazed how you've thrown yourself into this, right? I mean, and I want to say this because I think it's really important for people to hear. I one time was with probably one of the largest tier 1 automotive players in Europe. And I was at their headquarters, and was being introduced to their chief sustainability officer, who, with all due respect, I have to say was probably my age, so an older guy in our industry. And I looked at him and I said, "Wow, you're the chief sustainability for this company. If you don't mind me saying, what are your credentials? How did you get to be chief sustainability officer?" Didn't want to say, "Gosh, you're old like me, so why are you in it?" But you know what he said to me? He said, "Mark, nobody is an expert in chief sustainability roles right now, right? We This is a new industry and it's evolving so fast." He said, "Where my passion is for the planet, for the earth." And he said, "I think if we can do it differently, we should." And I said, "I say that often myself." So he said, "What I did a lot of reading. I did a lot of understanding of what is out there. I try to dig into the GHG protocols and all those things." He said, "You're right. I don't have a degree in sustainability as I'm an engineer, but I'm passionate about what I do." And I think that's what you are, right? You are passionate about this topic, which is why I applaud you for starting these podcasts with people that might have something to impart on people. The other thing I would say is, since we're going to do this on a YouTube channel, right, geez, this is great that we're doing it. If there are young people looking at this, I cannot stress enough. I made a lot of speeches in the US back when I started companies here in the US, or part of a team that started companies. I used to say a lot, we have to stop thinking that college is everything, right? Not everybody needs to go to college. Not everybody should go to college. And you don't need a college degree to work in one of these really cool steel mills, right? It's not like what it used to be, right? And you and I are from the Pittsburgh area, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We remember what it used to be like. Today, it's almost like playing computer games. So as we get into this idea of Earth and planet as part of our industry, I also want to stress the fact that these are highly technology-driven plants. And I think we need to get younger people into this industry, because there's too many people like you and I who are nearing the end of our careers, and we need the young people to get into it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you get around. I mean, I remember the first time I interviewed with a company called Bethlehem Steel only 100 years ago. And I was around all the molten steel, and I saw the scale and the scope of everything. I mean, I said, I got to be a part of this. It just there's something about steel and steel making, and then once you get into it, you see where the actual steel goes, and you see the skyscrapers going up, you see the bridges getting built, you understand that this is behind ships, all your cars,
It's everything.
It's
Anybody could sit anywhere and look around, and within 10 feet you have steel products around you. You got lots of them, right? So it's one of those primary industries that I think is vital the way we live, and therefore we must make sure that it also helps our planet exist a long, long time after we are gone. So I think that's really an important part of it. You and I both started. Think about it. You and I both started in the blast furnace BOF industry. That's where I
there was
started
open
too.
hearts at Bethlehem Steel when I was there. Open hearts.
Yeah, it's hard to
It
believe.
was the last open hearts in the U.S.
Yeah. I mean, I started at National Steel. You started at Bethlehem Steel. Unfortunately, neither of them exist today. And I talk about that a lot. We talk about the European steel industry. At times it's been frustrating for me to think about the European steel industry, that they haven't made that transition that the US made, right?
Yeah.
I don't understand why the flat roll, because most of the flat roll made in Europe is still blast furnace, BOF furnace making steel. Why did they not make the transition to EAF steel making sooner? I don't understand why. You brought up scrap a few minutes ago, scrap Armageddon. I think I remember that in 1995 or 1993, there was an article that, boy, if we change our industry here in the US to EAF, there'll be a huge scrap shortage. We're still a net exporter of scrap in the United States.
That's right. Yep.
So is Sweden, so is UK, right? So scrap is not net short. I do think, you mentioned scrap. I do think you have to start considering, as part of the definition of green, which, by the way, is part of the definition of green by OEMs, the automotive makers in Europe. Part of the definition of green requires not only how steel is made and the energy inputs, but it also is going to require a certain level of scrap. And the reason being, we cannot lose sight of the product life cycle. We have to keep that total life cycle assessment as part of our equation is for decarbonization as well. Scrap could be debated whether it has a backpack value of CO2 or not, but scrap does lower your CO2 footprint the way it is defined today. And so scrap is going to be an important part of the decarbonization. But to make the higher grades of steel, and Randy, this is where you're the metallurgist and I'm the sales guy. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but the higher grades of steel require a lower residual scrap, which we would call prime scrap or automotive scrap typically. That I do think could be the creme de la creme of scrap in the future. It could become much, much higher priced because it could become a net short market. However, this is why companies like H2 Green Steel and others who are trying to get into this virgin iron making business is so critical. We're going to need that virgin iron to be part of the equation so we can make the higher grades of steel.
That's right.
And now the rub here, as you peel the onion back, the funny thing, think about what I just said. Iron making does increase your CO2 footprint versus scrap. So if you can make everything from scrap and have an infinite supply of scrap, and you can make the high grades of steel of scrap, you wouldn't need new iron making. But the point is, you do need iron making.
You will.
So you have to have iron making to offset some of those high residual scraps that you're going to use to also keep the cost of the product down. This is that peeling the onion back that is really, we could have a whole nother podcast on this, right? Scrap and the integral part of all this is really important. But it's why some people say, well, we'll just make it all out of scrap. That's just, they don't understand the industry. They don't understand how steel's made. You're still going to need some virgin iron units to be able to make particularly the higher grades of steel. I would say probably all flat roll needs some level of virgin iron. I think that's pretty much known. But the higher grades are going to require more and more of it. So
if the world economies are growing, we're going to need more and more steel, and we're going to need access to the raw materials, and that's a critical part of the whole decarbonization. Is how you decarbonize that and the alloy side of the thing. So, I tell you, we could talk about this for hours.
We
could. Well, I do want to just say thank you. Thank you very much for sitting down with me today and chatting about this.